One of you can please confirm if you can see my screen.
Sir, you are not audible. Clearly.
Okay, how about now? Is it better now? Hello.
Maybe some issues in my I checked it.
Okay. Anyone else? Can anyone else confirm if the sound is okay or if it's low?
So now it's okay.
It's now fine. Okay, thank you. Okay. Uh, I'll try to be as loud as I can. Okay. So basically, in our last session, we were introduced to the service layer. We were basically working with this company called Geekster Insurance. Okay, just to give you a recap, they had 3 products. They had mobile insurance. Okay, they had vehicular insurance. Okay, and they had life insurance. These are the 3 products they had. Okay, and we basically designed the customer journey API. That is, we designed this registration flow, okay, which had the following steps. 1 second. Create customer, add customers dependent or nominee. Okay, this is a sign up flow, and then we had create customers wallet, and 4 is add ₹100 to the wallet. Okay, these were the things that we worked on. We basically implemented the APIs, and we implemented the we created the service classes. Okay, we did not implement the actual logic of creating the wallet because that's not in the scope. That will come when we deal with databases and everything. But on the hierarchy level, we have the registration API, which has the sign up link, and it basically, you can see the controller receives the request. We have the validation done here, and then we call one service to basically create the customer. Then in the next step, we call the nominee service to get the nominee details created, and then we call the wallet service. So in this example, we saw how the controller was responsible for 2 things. One was validation of the request. Second thing was ordering or sequencing the service call. Okay. Here we called 3 services in a sequence. Okay. Now what we'll do is we'll focus basically on designing the APIs better. Okay. As in, because in a real life scenario, when you're working with APIs, I mean, mostly service layers, chances are, if you ever work in a microservice architecture, many of the service calls underneath are going to be making HTTP calls to other services. Okay. Here, we are building a monolith application. Basically, when we go towards building the database, you will see that the customer details, the nominee details, and all those things sit in one single database. But in a microservice architecture, what happens is this call, this nominee wala call, this might actually be going to another service. This might be making an HTTP call. Okay. So you are, when you start working for companies, very rarely will you work in monolithic architecture. You are most likely going to work with microservices. Okay. So because you have microservices, uh, you have to design your API in a much better way. Okay. So if you look at our API at this point, for example, if I, let's take this API, for example, or let's take this API, for example. Okay. Wallet service is basically a service layer. Okay. It has a bunch of, give me 1 second. Huh? Okay. Yeah. All right. So if you see here, the idea is that um, you're going to create a wallet and you're going to add money to that wallet. Okay, this is the service. So when somebody is consuming the service, they basically would have to they are expecting that a wallet is going to be returned after this. Okay, when they call this method, they're expecting that a wallet, the updated wallet, is going to be returned at the end of the call. But sometimes, let's say the wallet creation fails. Okay, in that case, this wallet comes as null. Okay, like instead of returning the actual wallet object, you actually return a null object, which means that your client now has to basically handle that null. Okay, so we have already learned about optionals. This is a place where we are going to introduce optional. Okay, so we're going to change our API design a little bit. We'll wrap this thing inside an optional. Okay, so that if something goes wrong in any of these APIs, okay, if something goes wrong in any of these APIs, it's not going to return a null, it's going to return an optional. Okay, let me go back and change it here. For now, let's just return this. Okay, okay, all right. So this is the registration flow. Let us think of another flow, okay, which we are going to implement. Let's say that okay, how do we, what else can we create? Give me a second to think about this thing. Okay, so insurance add flow. Okay, basically what happens is uh, you're going to create an insurance product, like how you have mobile insurance. We're going to create these three insurances. Okay, so firstly, before we go ahead and design the service layer APIs, let us first decide how the DTO will look like. Okay, let's actually first decide the controller layer part. Okay, then we'll decide the service layer. Okay, so we're going to work through this insurance add flow. So what is the API that we're going to have? The API will be, let's say, insurances. Okay, and the method here would be a post method. Okay, all right. How is a request structure going to look? Okay, before we talk about the request structure, let's decide how the insurance would look. Okay, so if we have an insurance class, okay, we will have an insurance name. Okay, and we'll have status. What else is there? Insurance status, insurance name, maybe created on. Okay, expired on. Okay, this. And let's say you have these policies. Okay, basically says that you can at max cover 2 elements. Okay, let's say mobile. So the difference between an insurance and a insurance policy is, insurance policy basically determines what things are required. Okay, so here we'll say that under mobile insurance you can add at max, you can cover at max 2 mobile devices. Okay, devices is 2. then you can say that the max insured sum is 50,000. Okay. Yeah. So basically what you're saying is that for this particular, I mean, for a mobile insurance, we're going to cover two devices. You can add two devices, either a tablet or an iPad or an iPhone or a normal phone. You can add any such two devices under this insurance, and the total sum would be 50,000. This is my policy in this case. Okay. Let's say here I'll say cover item would be at max 1, and max insurance sum would be 75,000. If something happens to your car, maximum insurance would be 75,000. And let's say under this, two people's death can be covered. Okay. And the maximum sum would be, let's say, max insured sum is, let's say, 5 lakhs. This is a very realistic data. Like you would most probably see something like this. So idea is that when we our system needs to have something like this. Okay. So if you see here, tomorrow the company may decide to increase the sum number. Okay. They may make it 60. Okay. Or maybe they can increase the item to, like, the maximum covered devices to 3. Okay. So this is a changeable thing. Okay. This can always change. So what we do is we will have something called insurance policy. Okay. In insurance policy, we'll say items. If it's difficult or confusing to understand, just wait for a few minutes. I'll explain what I just did here. Okay. And then I'll say max insured sum. Okay. All right. So how this is going to happen is, let's say you create a mobile insurance. Okay. Today, when you started, you said that I'm going to cover 2 devices. Max amount would be 50,000. Okay. Tomorrow you can say that I want to get more customers, so I'm going to change this to, let's say, 80,000. Okay. So there are two ways of doing this thing. You can either mutate the data, as in you can come and you can just update the valuation there. Okay. Or what you can do is you can keep this thing as it is. Okay. You can just create one more this thing with the value, and then basically link this part to that mobile insurance. Okay. What did I do here? I have a mobile insurance, which basically has the name, status, and created on, expired on. And then I have the policy, the insurance policy, which decides how the insurance is going to work, how many devices are going to be covered, what is the maximum amount that we can cover, that we can pay out in case mobile theft happens or something happens of their insurance. Okay. Initially, we started with this, but then the company decided that, okay, let me try out something. Let me see if I can acquire more customers. So they changed it to 80,000. Okay. So there are two ways of doing it. You can either go and change the existing amount to 80,000, or you can create a brand new policy, insurance policy altogether. The good thing about this is, good thing about creating a new policy is that when you have your, when the company decides to go back to the old principles, right? You don't have to go back and change the data again. You can simply just link this mobile insurance to this policy. Okay. It's so if I could explain this to you, it could be something like this. Mobile insurance, initially it was at policy 1. Okay. Which basically said devices 2, max covered 50,000. Okay. And then tomorrow the company decided that we're going to change that thing because we want to experiment with something. So they said that we'll cover 80,000. We'll pay up 80,000, but then that didn't work. So they said that revert back to this old one. So you can go ahead and change this back to 1. Okay. Understood? This is what we're going to do. Okay. Now, okay. So if, as you can see here, there are going to be basically two things at this point. Okay. One is your insurance. The insurance would need to have the policy ID. Okay. It basically, which will basically tell what policy you're referring to. Are you referring to policy 1 or policy 2 or policy 3? Okay. Similarly, we're going to have something called insurance policy, which is going to be basically, it will have its own ID. It will have its own, let's say, what do we have? Items covered. Okay. And it will have max sum. Okay. These 3 things. All right. Is this part understood what I'm trying to do? Does anyone have any confusion about this?
Clear, sir.
Clear, right?
Yeah, sir.
Okay, cool. So,
Sir, can you explain was? Can
who
you
is
repeat
this?
this
Abhishek.
part, sir?
Abhishek.
Yes,
Acha,
sir.
acha. Huh. So see, this was a registration flow which we did yesterday, right? So I'm going to remove this thing. Okay. The company says that I'm going to sell the insurance, and what I want is, if you have if you know anything about insurance, you know that the insurance has some coverage. Okay, it says that how many people, if it's a life insurance, it says that you can insure 2 people under it, or you can insure just yourself and your family under it. Okay, based on the so these things are called policies. Okay, a life insurance can have many variations. In one life insurance, you can cover only yourself, or you can cover you and your immediate dependents, or you can cover your yourself, your child, your spouse, your in-laws, your own mother and father, and the amounts will vary accordingly. Okay, so the product is one here, which is life insurance, but the policies are different, right? Based on the amount you're paying, the policies differ. So since that is the case, right, you have to think of it in such a way where your product is one thing, but your policy is the part that varies. Okay, you can if you have 3 different requirements, that one says that if somebody is paying 50,000 15,000 per year, cover him and his wife, so that's one policy. If he pays, let's say, 25,000, cover him, his wife, and his parents and his children, so that's one more policy. If it says that he pays 50,000 and cover everyone in his family, that's policy number 3. You understood this part, right? Under the same insurance name, you have different policies. Did you get this?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's what we are doing here. Basically, our product name is one. Like, if you ever go for policy or anything, you'll see that the same product name has different variations. So the variation part is the policy wala part. Okay, so when you're creating an insurance, you have to basically tell which policy ID you want this insurance to be. So let's say my insurance name would be mobile 2. Okay, then if I have another policy which covers 3, I'll say mobile 3. Okay, something like this. So the reason why I demonstrated this is because I want you to understand that these two things are actually separate. Okay, you can plug in this one, like if this initially has 1, you can simply change it and say that point to 2 now. Okay, so first thing we have to do is we have to create the policy, we have to define the rules. Okay, and then we have to basically define the insurance. Okay, once we have fixed these two things, then we can actually talk about the insurance flow, which will then require what type of request will be accepted, what type of response would be given. Okay, so this is our internal structure. Okay, which is also known as models. This is what our services are going to use. Okay, now what is the API that we're going to have? Let's talk about that. So we're going to have basically, how do we do this? We'll have, let's say, an API where we say policies, okay? And we'll have another API which will say insurances, okay, something like this. So a post call to policy will create this, and insurance to this. A post call to this insurance would basically create the insurance, okay? So we're still at controller layer. Let's see how the request for this would look. Okay, request for this would look very simple. You would give the items covered. This is what I'm creating the policies, okay? Okay. This is how the request will be. What will the response look like? The response will look like this, okay? It will give you the ID, okay? And then it will basically give you these things. But it will also have, let me just divide it up into HTTP status code, which will say 201, I think 201 stands for created. HTTP status 201. Correct, 201. So when you decide to create this thing, we'll say created, okay? And you can also have a type here, okay? This will basically tell us what insurance type it is for which you're creating this. Is this mobile insurance or life, something like this, okay? Yeah. Okay, this would be the, sorry, 1 second. Okay. Here you would get the type back, whatever you have decided the type to be. Okay. This would be the response. Status code would be 200. This would be the body of the request. Okay, done for now. For insurance API, the request would be the name of the insurance, okay, type of the insurance, created on, okay, not expired, like deactivated on. This is like when the company decides to no longer pursue this insurance. And this will be status, and this will have a policy ID, okay? This is how the request for this would look. And when you're creating the response, right? Let's say we decide to do it this way: HTTP status code, okay? Possible status codes are 201 if it is created, okay? And like, yeah, that's it. You can have other things like 404 if it's not found. So let's say you pass a policy ID which doesn't exist, so you'll get a 404, okay? Let's say you have given some wrong data in the request. For that you'll get 400, okay? 400 stands for bad request. Similarly here, the status would be 201 in case of successful creation, 400 in case you send a bad request. And since you're not looking for anything, like in this API request, you're just going to create it. You're not doing anything. So this is what it'll be. And in case something happens internally, some server crashes down or something, it would be 500. Okay. Similarly here, 200 would be the, if the request gets created properly, 201 because it got created. there is something called 404, which basically means that this policy ID doesn't exist. So something in this thing doesn't exist. Okay, 400 means bad request. Now, there is a possibility that somebody tries to create the same request again and again. Okay, so we'll have to, let's say, we'll make sure that if somebody is creating a policy for live or mobile, with let's say items covered as 2 and amount as 20,000. Okay, if somebody has already created this policy, they should not be able to create it again. Okay, which means that there can be a collision. You have already created a policy ID, but you are now trying to create the same thing again. So for that, the HTTP status is I think already exists status code. 409. 409 is what we'll be sending. Okay, because there is a conflict of resource. So which means that the possible here would be 400, 409. Okay. Yep, that's it. Similarly, when you're trying to create a this thing, insurance, let's say you have created a mobile insurance saying mobile 2, and then you have a policy ID linked up here. If you try to create the same request again, we'll be sending you a 409. Okay, is this part clear? How we are arriving at these HTTP status codes? Or does anyone want me to explain again?
Yes, sir. Clear,
Clear?
sir.
Clear. Okay, cool. So these are the possible responses we can have. What will be the request body here? So when you design an API, right, you always have to think on the broad level. When you're sending a response, what are the possible responses that there can be? Similarly, what are the possible status codes there can be? You can either have it created, or you're looking for a resource which is not found, because creation of insurance depends on the policy ID. If you pass an invalid policy ID or it doesn't exist, it will be 404. Okay. Or let's say you have passed some invalid data here, that will be 400. Or you're already sending duplicate shit, that's 409. Or if something goes wrong, that's 500. Okay, body here would look like this. Body here is going to look like this, except this. Here we're not going to send the policy ID. Here we're going to send the entire policy data itself, which means this entire thing. Okay, cool. This is what we're going to send in our response. Okay, okay, that's basically the controller layer. Okay, this is the controller layer. Now let's decide the service layer. Let's look at let me actually open this thing again. Can we do it separately here? Okay, let's design the service layer here. Okay, so we have already decided these two data types. Okay, this is for insurance policy. Okay, this is for insurance itself. Okay, both of these things are dealing with just one single thing, which is insurance, right? So our service name would be insurance service. Okay, that's it. Now, what are the methods we can have here? Let's see. First thing is somebody is trying to create a policy. So we'll have something called create policy. Okay, which will take a insurance policy object. Okay, something like this. Now, if you do get the policy created, then you will probably return an insurance policy object back. Okay, if not, then it could be null, right? Because if something goes wrong, instead of doing this, what we can say is I'll send an optional of null. I'm sorry, optional of insurance policy. So in case it happens properly, it's fine, or otherwise we'll just use option. Okay. Yep. Okay, this is one way of doing it. This is the creation part. Actually, let me do this. Let's not use optional in this case because this is the creation policy, right? So if when you're trying to create a policy, a new resource, and there's a conflict, something like this, okay, how do you tell the controller, or how do you signal the controller that, hey, something went wrong and I'm not able to create it, this thing? There are two ways of doing this thing, okay? One is you send a or optional, okay? If you do that, then basically your controller would not get to know what went wrong. Let's say underneath this in create policy, you're basically doing multiple things. Let's say you're doing 3 steps. You're calling another service, you're checking the database, and you're doing ton of other things, and then you're actually creating the policy, okay? In that case, if you have 3 steps, and 3 steps can go wrong for 3 possible reasons, sending a null value or an optional would not tell the controller what went wrong, okay? For that, what we'll do is in this API, we're not going to use optional, okay? We're going to throw exceptions. You guys have learned about exceptions class. Throwing exceptions from the service layer will tell the controller exactly what went wrong, because based on those 3 steps, exactly which step failed, we can send a custom exception from that step, which will then be caught by our controller and it will be done, okay? So let's actually go ahead and implement this thing, okay? The first thing I'll do is I'll head over. This part is clear, right, for everyone? Does anyone have any confusion? We're not going with optional because at the point of creation, if there are multiple steps involved and something fails, we don't want to send an optional, because this is an API or a service method which is actually creating a new resource. So we have to throw exceptions which can tell us what went wrong exactly, okay? So let's go ahead here and let me close all of these things. It's very important that you understand these steps, because this will help you, like if you have if you have rounds like what's that called, machine coding round, companies like Flipkart and everything, such sort of thinking actually helps. What is this? This is basically saying that get me an optional, so I'll just say optional. I'll change this to optional. Okay, and optional dot get this. Okay, that's fine. Cool. Okay, we'll close this API. So what is the first thing that we'll do? The first thing is we'll actually build the internal structures, okay? Which means models. Let's come to model here. First thing is insurance policy, okay? Insurance policy, private long ID, private, what is this? Items covered, okay? This will be an integer, items covered, okay? And the next thing is max sum. So private, big decimal. Always try to work with big decimal whenever you're working with price or anything like that. Yes.
Sir, I am a little bit confused optional, sir.
Achha,
Where we can use optional and any explain through this example, sir. Where
achha,
we can
when we can use
use
optional and when we can throw exceptions.
optional.
That's your question, right? Hello.
Option.
Achha, can you just type your question? Type your question, I'll answer it. Please type your question on chat and I'll answer.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Let me, until he gets back, let me just open this chat window here. Okay. Cool. Okay. Big decimal and max. Where we can use optional. Okay. So basically, whenever you have to return something. Okay. Let's say somebody is saying you have a method which says get insurance, get policy. or something like get this, get that. In those cases, right? Uh, because the method itself says that it's going to return something, which means there are two possibilities. Okay, let me get back to this. Let me show you with this diagram. Okay, let's say we have this thing, get policy by ID. Okay, we have such a method where we take the ID. Okay, now if you look at this method, it basically says that it'll give you a policy object if you give this guy an ID. Okay, so this guy consumes an ID and then it'll give you a policy return. Okay, this is the return type. Now in this case, if something goes wrong internally, let's say you're trying to fetch the policy by ID, but the database call fails, or let's say something happens, you're calling some other third-party service, you're making a REST API call from here, right? And that failed, which means that execution will stop at this point, right? Which means if let's say you have something like this, step 1, step 2, and then step 3. Okay, step 3 is where you return, it's a new policy. Okay, but let's say at this point it failed, so the Java will not go up to this part, right? The compiler will return it immediately. So at this point it doesn't have the policy value, right? So instead, if you know, in Java the default value for every class is null. That's the, like, not every class. If you are working with integer, it's 0, boolean it's false, string it's empty string, but for any other object it's going to be a null. So at this point, when the system crash, not system crashes, when the API call fails, the Java has to return something. The default return value is going to be null. Okay, now if you send a null value, let's say whoever is calling this particular method has not put a null check there, then for him that call is going to fail. It is going to give a null pointer exception. Okay, so in situations like this where your method has promised to return something, it is always a good idea to wrap this with optional. Okay, this optional will force the third-party client or whoever is calling this method, this will force the caller to basically implement the null check, or let's just say implement this optional check, because optional has this thing, right? Policy, if present, something like that. They will have to do this thing, otherwise they won't be able to retrieve their object. Okay, understood? These are basically scenarios where you would use optional. Does that answer your question, Abhishek?
Okay, sir.
Good. If you
Yes, sir.
don't worry, as you start as we start coding more, we'll understand the exact use case. Okay, so for now I'm just using the insurance policy. Why am I using insurance policy? Because that is the first thing. To create insurance, I have a dependency on policy ID, so I have to create the insurance policy first. So let's go ahead and say some insured. Okay, this is my building block for this. The next building block would be insurance itself. Okay, insurance data. Okay, let's say private long, this too will have an insurance ID, private string name. Okay, and what are the qualities? Hey, give me 1 second. Hey, sorry guys. Actually, let's do one thing. Let's take a 5 minutes break, and then we'll come back and discuss the rest. Okay. Google Countdown. Let's take a 5 minutes break. Okay. Hey, okay. So as we were doing here, let's just build this one. This part, name, status. Status will have to give created on. Let's keep it a string for now. Created. This is the expired on. And we'll have something like private, because we'll have this policy ID. Let's say policy ID. Okay. All right. One thing we missed out is insurance status. Okay. No, not success. It's going to be active, inactive. Okay. So all right. Cool. So these are done. Let's actually go ahead and create the service layer. Okay. Yeah. So in the service layer, we'll just have one this thing, insurance service. Okay. All right. Now, first thing is you have to create the policy, right? So you'll say create insurance policy. Okay, where you'll basically pass the insurance policy. Okay, and this will actually return an insurance policy. Okay, now let's see what are the things that can go wrong here. Let's take a look at this. What are the things that can go wrong here? You have the ID will be system generated. Items covered is something. Sum covered is something. So possible things where it can go wrong is somebody says items covered is -2. Okay, that's an invalid this thing. Okay, never mind. We are not going to be validating the data at the service layer. We'll be doing it at the controller layer. So for now, this is what it is. Creating the insurance policy would basically create this thing. That's it. That's done. There's nothing more than that. Next thing is getting the insurance policy by the policy ID. So we'll say now in this case, we'll say get insurance policy by ID. Okay. Final long insurance ID. Yeah. And this time here we're going to use option. Why am I using option here? Because there may not be an ID. Somebody might pass. When you're writing the service layer, you always have to think from the service layer's point of view. If somebody passes a wrong insurance ID, what will you do? Will you throw an exception or will you give an optional back? Okay. And basically there's you can do this in many ways. You can immediately throw an exception. Any step something is not found, you can immediately throw an exception, or you can return an option. Okay, if this is a very critical API where the execution must be stopped, in that case you will be throwing an exception. Okay, this here at this point. Okay, this is a very critical API because let's say if you're not able to connect to the database, you don't want to go to the next step, so you will actually end the execution right there and you would return an insurance policy. Okay, however in this case you're just reading something, there's no change in the database happening. So if something does happen internally, you don't necessarily have to throw an exception. You can just say that I'm going to return you an option where you may or may not have the value. Okay, so we'll say insurance policy. Okay, that's it. These are the only two things we need for insurance policy. Okay, now next thing is insurance itself. Okay, so we have to create an insurance. So we'll say insurance, yeah, create insurance. Okay, one second now. Insurance, okay, and then we have optional of if somebody is trying to read the insurance, then they can say get insurance by ID. Here they will basically pass the insurance ID. Okay, that's it. Okay, so insurance policy and insurance ID, that's it. Okay, now let's talk about the create insurance part. Okay, now you know that when you're trying to create an insurance, you have a dependency on the policy ID, which means that for this call to be successful, the policy has to be there, right? Which means now there is an issue. What if you do not find the policy itself? Let's say you have queried this thing, like you said create the insurance, and then you have basically figured out that the policy ID that I passed here is wrong. So there is no optional because you have to return an insurance at this point, right? At this point, you would want to stop the execution, which means this here should throw an exception called insurance policy not found or something like this. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go here, package exceptions, and we'll write insurance policy not found exception. Okay. Okay, that's it. Now you will have public insurance policy not found exception. This is a custom exception we're throwing here. So we'll pass the string message. We'll call the super method and we'll say message. This will throw an error because this needs to be now here. There is a very this is a very crucial point to decide whether to throw just a compile time exception or a runtime exception. Okay, so you can throw either of these. Okay, but the general preference is that you throw a runtime exception. Okay, now let me explain why a runtime exception. So if you look at your API here, let me make this an exception. Okay, if you look at this thing, if this is a runtime exception, insurance policy not found, and this method can throw that, you will have to go here and say throws insurance policy not found exception, right? Tomorrow, if you have something else, let's say you modify your create insurance method in such a way that it has to call one more step. Okay, let's say there are 2-3 steps involved here, and of those 2-3 steps, another step fails. Okay, so then you will have to go ahead and throw one more exception, right? Which means you will then have to go ahead and add your something else, like let's say illegal argument exception, right? This is going to be a problem because in the future this is going to stop your code from becoming flexible. Okay, because the larger your code base is, the more possibilities of exceptions, and that means that the signature will continuously keep changing. If let's say you have 500 clients who use this thing, the moment you upgrade your this thing and you add one more exception here, they will all have to handle this particular thing. Okay, so this is the problem with compile time exceptions. The methods will be forced to handle it. Okay, which is why usually whenever you're working on a microservice architecture, the idea is that you always throw a runtime exception. If you throw a runtime exception, your method signature remains the same. Okay, because if I change this to, let's say, runtime exception, okay, you don't necessarily have to add the this thing here. Let me just give you an example. So this is my insurance service, right? I'll go ahead and I'll have an implementation here called default insurance service. Okay, implements insurance service. Okay, done. Now here you would be implementing the methods here. Okay, that's it. Now what is the problem with this thing? Let's say I change this to saying throws insurance policy not found exception. Okay, and I change this thing to exception, which means it's a compile time exception. Okay, so this API basically says that I can give you an insurance object, but there's a possibility that I can also give you this insurance policy not found exception. So what will happen is it will then have to basically, what's going on here? Yeah. It will then basically have to add this signature here, throws insurance policy not found exception. Okay, and then you will have to basically have a code block here which throws that exception. So let's actually go with this. Okay, I'll just explain the problem with just this thing. So when I extend it by exception, it becomes a compile time exception, right? And I'm saying that this method here will be basically doing this insurance policy not found exception. So let's see how that's done. Okay, so we'll actually implement the steps here. First thing is I'll get the long insurance policy ID, insurance.get policy ID, done. And we'll say basically check if there's a policy with this or not, right? So we'll say final optional insurance policy optional. I'll call this method itself get insurance policy by ID, where I'll pass the insurance policy ID. Okay, now at this point I'll check, is this present or not? Insurance policy optional is present. Okay, if this is present, then this will go ahead and do this thing normally. If this is not present, then basically I have to throw an exception, right? Or to make the code more readable, what I'll do is I'll say if this is not present, I'll add a NaN case here. Okay, I'll negate this condition here. If this insurance policy is not present, throw new insurance policy not found exception, where you say the no insurance policy found by ID, insurance policy ID. Okay, that's it. This will throw an exception, otherwise it'll basically return a no insurance, new blank insurance. Okay, this is how it is. So you can see that this insurance policy not found is basically intermittently done with this. Now let's say there is one more step. Okay, tomorrow in the future I'll just use a simple true block here, which basically throws a illegal argument exception. Okay, why is this a runtime exception? That's a runtime exception. So let me just throw some, let's say URL not found exception, malformed URL exception. Okay, if you add a malformed URL exception here, it basically says that this cannot be thrown from this point because you already have declared this to be of throwing this, which means you'll have to go back to this and you'll be changing this to malformed URL exception. When you do this, only then it will basically start working. Only then it will start working. Okay, so what did I do here? Let me undo everything again. Okay, what did I do here? I initially wrote my service layer API to be giving me insurance. In case anything goes wrong, it will give me this insurance policy not found exception. Okay, so I implemented my method in that way, and you can see insurance policy not found is part of the exception class, which is the compile time exception. Okay, so far so clear. Now, if tomorrow, let's say, another step gets added, which throws let's say malformed URL exception. Okay, some random exception it throws. If you do that, because malformed URL exception is a compile time exception, you would have to accommodate this. Okay, which means you would have to add this signature here. You would have to say that malformed URL exception. Okay, because this implements an interface, which means you will now have to go to this interface and you will now have to change it here as well.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, your voice is too low, sir.
Okay, now is it better?
Yes, now better.
Okay. So you guys understood, right? If I add one more exception here, I will have to change this method signature here and then this method signature here, right? That's not very, that's not a good thing because you will have to continuously change this thing. Okay. Which is why what we do is we decide not to have any service method that throws certain exceptions. What we can do instead is make all of these things a runtime exception. Okay. Get rid of this and let me get rid of this. Okay. What I'll say is, if you do not find the policy number, throw a runtime exception. Okay. When you throw a runtime exception from your service layer, your method signature really doesn't change. Tomorrow, if you have to add one more exception, let's say if true, throw illegal argument exception. Okay, something like this. Okay, if you do this, if you this is another runtime exception, you can throw this and your method will remain unchanged. Okay, so I would encourage that when you start working for companies and you have to write service layer API something like this, always use runtime exceptions. Okay, because if you use compile time exceptions, then your API becomes quite inflexible. Okay, because if I used runtime exception, I mean compile time exception here, then to add just one more exception to my method, I would either have to do that, like change the signature of the method, or I would be creating something like create insurance too, something like this. I'll have to create one more method and tell everyone that, hey, use this method. This is not a very good way of designing. So you would go with this, and inside of your service layer, you can throw as many of our runtime exceptions as you want. Is this point clear? Is there any confusion so far as to what to throw, what exception to throw, and when to throw an exception and when to return an option? If you understand these things, then you can design service layer in a much better way. Okay, since there are no questions, I'll move on to this. Okay, so Abhishek has a question.
Exception wala part, sir.
Exception wala part. अच्छा
Yes.
ठीक है. हाँ.
Can you repeat this?
हाँ,
Yes, sir.
तो बेसिकली तुमको समझ में आ गया ना कि कहाँ पे ऑप्शनल करना है, कहाँ पे एक्सेप्शन थ्रो करना है, वो वाला समझ में आ गया?
हाँ सर,
हाँ, ठीक है, ठीक है. अब देखो, यहाँ पे मेरा एक API है, ठीक है, ये मतलब एक सर्विस लेयर का एक मेथड है, ठीक है. अब मान लो मेरे यहाँ पे मैं क्या बोल रहा हूँ, यहाँ पे बोल रहा हूँ कि इंश्योरेंस बनाने के लिए मेरे को एक करेक्ट पॉलिसी आईडी चाहिए, ठीक है. जब तुम यहाँ पे इम्प्लीमेंट कर रहे हो, तुम पहले पॉलिसी आईडी एक्सट्रैक्ट कर रहे हो, फिर तुम पूछ रहे हो कि मेरे को वो पॉलिसी इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी ढूंढ के दो जो इस आईडी से है, ठीक है। अगर तुम्हारे पास वो है तो ठीक है, अगर पॉलिसी नहीं है उस आईडी में, मान लो किसी ने गलत पॉलिसी आईडी सेंड किया, तो फिर तुम क्या करोगे उस टाइम पे? उस टाइम पे तुमको एग्जीक्यूशन बंद करना पड़ेगा, उस टाइम पे तुमको सिग्नल देना पड़ेगा कंट्रोलर को कि जो डेटा मेरे पास आया है वो डेटा गलत है एंड मैं इस डेटा के साथ काम नहीं कर सकता हूँ, ठीक है। तो उस समय तुमको एक्सेप्शन थ्रो करना पड़ेगा। अब क्वेश्चन ये है कि किस टाइप के एक्सेप्शन थ्रो करें, इज इट कंपाइल टाइम एक्सेप्शन और इज इट रन टाइम एक्सेप्शन? तो अगर हम लोग कंपाइल टाइम एक्सेप्शन यूज करते हैं यहाँ पे, ठीक है, जैसे कि ये मेरा कस्टम एक्सेप्शन है, मैं इसको एक्सेप्शन कर देता हूँ, ठीक है। जैसे ही मैं इसको एक्सेप्शन कर दिया वो कंपाइल टाइम एक्सेप्शन हो गया। तो यहाँ पे मेरे को बताना पड़ेगा, तो बेसिकली मेरे यहाँ से इस मेथड से अगर मैं ये थ्रो करूँ तो ये बोलेगा कि अनहैंडल्ड एक्सेप्शन, ऐड एक्सेप्शन टू द मेथड सिग्नेचर, ठीक है, क्योंकि तुम ये चेक्ड एक्सेप्शन कंपाइल टाइम एक्सेप्शन सेंड कर रहे हो। तो मैंने यहाँ पे ऐड किया, ठीक है। जैसे मैंने यहाँ पे ऐड किया, यहाँ पे भी मेरे को ऑटोमेटिकली ऐड हो गया, ठीक है, काम बन गया। अब मान लो 2-3 साल बाद तुम्हारा एक रिक्वायरमेंट आया कि इसी मेथड में तुमको और एक स्टेप ऐड करना है, ठीक है। और तुमने देखा कि और एक स्टेप ऐड करने के बाद, मान लो ये इफ ट्रू वाला पार्ट वो और एक स्टेप है, ठीक है। और एक स्टेप ऐड करने के बाद यहाँ पे कुछ और एक्सेप्शन थ्रो हो सकता है, ठीक है। जैसे कि मान लो मैं यहाँ पे malformed URL एक्सेप्शन कर लूंगा, ठीक है, फॉर एन एग्जाम्पल। मान लो 3 साल बाद तुम जब उसी एपीआई में काम कर रहे हो या फिर कोई नेक्स्ट डेवलपर जो आके काम कर रहे हो, उसको पता चला कि रिक्वायरमेंट के अनुसार मैं ऐसा एक स्टेप करूंगा जिसमें ये पॉसिबल एरर आ सकता है, ठीक है। तो तब वो यहाँ से इसको थ्रो करेगा, ठीक है। जब वो यहाँ से वो थ्रो करेगा, यहाँ पे प्रॉब्लम आएगा ऑलरेडी, क्योंकि ये बोलेगा कि ये मेथड में सिग्नेचर में ये है ही नहीं, तो
सर
आप
ये
इसको सिग्नेचर,
malformed
हाँ
URL एक्सेप्शन
हाँ,
कौन सा है?
क्या क्या, सॉरी,
malformed URL एक्सेप्शन में क्या error ये क्या
समझ में नहीं आ रहा है, कैन नॉट अंडरस्टैंड।
सर malformed
तुम एक बार चैट करो अपना सवाल इसमें,
हेलो
टाइप कर लो चैट में, ठीक है। Is it clear for everyone else? Can any one of you like tell me if this is clear with you or not? I'll explain Abhishek separately. Okay. All right. Do we have a question? Okay. Let Abhishek type his question and then we'll move forward. Okay. All right. Cool. So I guess it's like everyone else understood this thing. Or let him type his question. I'll explain it. Till then, we can go ahead and actually start implementing this thing. Okay. So what I'll do is I have implemented this create insurance wala part. Okay. So I'll actually go ahead. So what is malformed exception? See, malformed exception is basically a type of exception which is thrown when the URL is incorrect. Okay. But why am I using this malformed exception here? I'm saying that you have created this API, right? And let's say this API is already in use by 50 clients. Like there are 50 methods in this Java class who call this method. Okay. Now, tomorrow, the requirement changes. Okay. Tomorrow, the requirement changes and they basically add one more method. Okay. Let me actually give you an example. Let me say that let's say when somebody is trying to create an insurance, okay, they have passed a created on date which is in the past. Okay, like if today is 18th 04/2022, they have passed a date, okay, which is basically 17/04/2022. Okay, so this is not acceptable, right? I cannot create an insurance today backdated, right? So let's say you are now going to create a new exception. You're going to create a new exception here at this point saying insurance policy date exception. ठीक है, And what happened here is you checked, let's say you check this thing, is the created, sorry, how do I show it to you? Insurance.get created on, let's say that there's this method here which says is less than, I don't know if it's going to confuse you even more, but is less than today's, is less than today. Okay. And then you pass this insurance.get created on. Okay. Okay. Let me explain what is happening here. Okay. The first thing was, we came up with this idea and we said that we'll create an insurance, and we are saying here that if you cannot find anything by the policy ID, then go ahead and throw an exception saying insurance policy not found exception, which is of runtime exception. Sorry, compile time exception. For compile time exception, you basically go ahead and add this method signature here, which means you have to add the method signature here as well. Done. Tomorrow, your boss comes and says, I have to check the insurance creation time as well. If the insurance creation time is less than today's date, then don't accept, throw an error. Okay. So let's say you implement that logic. Okay. You write this is less than today here. Okay. It's not written at this point, but just imagine that you have this method written somewhere in your class, which takes the created on date, and it basically tells whether the date is older or whether the date is in the past or not. If the date is on the past, okay, if creation date is in the past, throw exception. This is your new requirement. Okay. So if this is the case, if it is less than this, then you throw this insurance. Insurance policy date exception. Okay. You pass this date exception, or let's just say that you pass this. Okay. Did you understand till this point, Abhishek, what I did here? I cannot hear you.
No, sir.
You didn't understand this?
Hello.
Huh? Did you understand this
No,
part?
sir.
You didn't understand. Okay. All right.
No, sir. I don't.
Acha, take it. Let me explain once again. We'll try once again. Okay. Did you understand this part? Did you understand what is happening here?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Tomorrow your boss comes. Let's say you wrote this code. Okay. Tomorrow your boss comes and says that we will not allow insurance to be created if the created date is in the past. Okay. So you are passing this created on date, right? Basically, the requirement now says that if at the time of making the request, this created on date is in the past, okay, which means today is 18/4/2022. Okay. If somebody sends you a request with this date 17/4/2022, then don't create the insurance. Is this statement clear?
Yes, sir.
Right? Okay. So what you do is you write this method. Okay. Private boolean is creation date in the past. Okay. And you basically pass the creation date. Okay. Let's say by default, I'll just return this to be false or just true. Yeah. Okay. Let's say you have written a method here where if you pass the creation date, it will tell you whether the creation date is today's date or in the future or not, or if it's in the past date. This much is clear what this method is doing.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you are going to use this method to basically figure out whether the insurance date is today's date or in the future date or in the past date. Okay. Now, requirement is if it is in the past date, you will not create the insurance. Okay. You will throw an exception saying that it is a date that I cannot accept. Okay. So you basically do this, like how you're checking here, if the insurance policy is optional or not, you call your custom method. You say is creation date in the past. Okay. And here you pass the insurance dot get created on. Okay. Is this part clear what's happening here?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now if this block is true, that means somebody has given you an insurance date which is in the past. You are not going to allow this. So you will throw an exception, throw new. You already have an exception here which says insurance policy date exception. So you will throw this insurance policy date exception. Is this clear what we did here? We threw an exception to stop the execution. If you now see, this is throwing this red underline, right? Why is this red underline? This is red underline because it says unhandled exception, add exception to method signature. It's basically saying that this method was earlier producing just one exception. Now it is producing two exceptions. One is insurance policy not found, and the other one is insurance policy date exception. But your method signature says it will only throw one exception. Okay. So to fix this thing, you will go ahead and add this insurance policy date exception. Okay. And you will go back to your service layer and you will add the same thing, insurance policy date exception. Is this much clear, Abhishek, what I've done
Yes,
here?
sir. Yes, sir. Clear, sir.
But do you see the problem with this? There may be 5. So let's say you have done this change after 2 years. Within those 2 years, whichever classes called this method, this particular create insurance, they all knew that I have to catch insurance policy exception. But now because you added this one more exception here, they are going to be forced to capture that exception as well. This is a problem, right? Because if you add, let's say, some other exception here, right, then you will have to change it here. Then every client, all those 50 clients will again have to check this. You see the problem, right, with this?
Sir,
Abhishek?
here we can write compile time and runtime error both one.
We can give both compile time and runtime error. But my point is that I'm just using compile time exception here. Okay?
Okay, sir.
I'm just throwing compile time exception. If I keep adding compile time exceptions, the method signature changes. Everyone who consumes this method will also have to check this thing. How can I explain this to you? Let's say that there is this registration controller. Okay? Registration controller has this private insurance service auto wired. Okay? And here it will be insurance service dot create insurance. Okay. In here, let's say they pass a blank insurance object. Okay. Let me go back to this and let me delete this. Okay. Abhi tak it just throws one exception. So your registration controller says, okay, it will throw one exception. Let me capture it with the try catch block. So it will basically go ahead and surround with the try catch. Okay. This is done. 2 years later, okay, somebody comes and adds this thing. So that means they will have to basically add this insurance policy date exception as well. Okay. Then what will happen is it will go to this signature. Okay. Then your registration controller, who's the consumer. Achha, why is this here? My bad. One second. Huh? Let me explain this to you once again. Just pay attention to this line, okay? Or just pay attention to this method signature here. It is just throwing insurance policy not found. Registration controller is saying, okay, there is an exception that is to be thrown. So let me go ahead and handle this. So they handle this exception. Okay, done. This much part is done. Okay. Now what happens is you add one more step which throws one more exception. Okay. Now for this to work, you have to basically go and add this in the signature. Okay. You say insurance policy date exception. In here also you add the same signature. Insurance policy date exception. Now when this happens, your default service is now going to break. Sorry, not default service. Your registration controller will now complain. It will say that earlier I was just capturing this exception. Now there is one more exception. I'll have to handle that exception as well. Okay. You understood the problem here, right? What happened? Because I changed the signature, I will now have to handle this error here. Okay. So what I can do is I can go ahead and add a, okay. So I have captured this thing. Now imagine doing this thing for 50 different classes. That's a problem, right? Did you understand, Abhishek, what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
This will be a problem because this is now just one method. Imagine you have 500 such methods. In 500 of those methods, you will have to adjust this change. This happens only when you use exception, which is compile time exception. If you change this to runtime exception, okay. If I now let's see, let's keep it exception. Let's change it back to this thing, and let's change it back to in here also. Let's change it to this. Okay. Let's say this is the new exception that I have to throw, right? Instead of making this a compile time exception, why don't I make this a runtime exception? If I make this a runtime exception, what is the advantage? Advantage is my method doesn't complain anymore. Okay. My method signature still remains the same, which means my interface method also remains the same, which means this guy, where is this guy? Registration controller. He also doesn't complain. Like if you just get rid of this, see, he doesn't complain either. So if you once again add one more runtime exception here, somewhere here after 3 years, nothing will change. Not this, not this, nothing will change. You understood the advantage of using runtime exception, Abhishek?
Yes.
Okay. So that's why in your API, okay, you always follow this principle. You always add runtime exceptions. So what I'll do is I'll also make this insurance policy not found exception a runtime exception. Okay. So when I go here and I change this to a runtime exception, this thing is not really required. Okay. This is not required in my default insurance. This is not required. You can see that my method now returns, like my method can now throw 2 different exceptions, but it won't complain. If I add another exception tomorrow, it won't complain, which means whoever is capturing this thing will also not be bothered about. This is the flexibility of using runtime exception. And I would personally advise that when you're writing service level methods, always use runtime exceptions. Okay. So we learned 2 principles today: when to use optional and when to use exceptions. And if we are using exception, what type of exception we throw. These are actually part of designing your API in a much better way, designing your service layer in a much better way. Okay. So that's this. Then let's go ahead and actually implement this thing. Okay. Let's return a new insurance. Okay. A blank new insurance. Okay. So in my controller, now I have to implement the controller logic, right? Controller layer. So what is in the controller layer? Controller layer, I said the request is going to look like this. I'll have policies controller and then I'll have insurance controller. Okay. So what I'll do here is I'll go here. I'll create a something like policy controller. Okay. REST controller request mapping policies. Okay. Now let's create the DTO for this. Okay. In the request, we'll have policy creation request. Okay. What does it have? It just has sorry, the request would be items covered, sum insured, and type. Okay. So now we'll have to introduce an enum here. We'll call it insurance type. Enum insurance type. It'll have 3 this thing. Did we already not have? No, we didn't. Okay. Here it will be mobile. and then it'll be vehicle, maybe life. Okay, cool. This is my policy creation request. So here I'll say items covered. So that will be private integer items covered. Okay, but my API here says that I will only be using this. So this key I'll be injecting here using the @JSON property. Okay, item. So whenever somebody sends a value for items covered, it will be injected here. Okay. Similarly, the next thing is max sum insured. So private big decimal max sum insured. Okay. What is the API key? Max sum insured. So we'll say max sum insured. Okay, done. Next thing is type here. Type remains the same. Private insurance type and just type. Okay, that's it. There's no JSON property that should be done on this. So this would be the policy creation part. Okay, so I'll now go to my policy controller here. SLF4J public. Public. We're going to return use response entity. We'll wrap the policy. Sorry, we'll have to now send a design the response body. Okay, response body has everything but the and the ID, right? So we'll create this thing here. We'll call it policy created response. Okay, that will actually have all the things here. Policy creation request. Okay, here we're saying return the ID, items covered, max insert sum, and this thing. So they'll all have the same thing. Along with that, they'll have something called private long ID. Okay, that's it. This will be my policy created response. So my controller will send a response entity of policy created response. Okay, create policy. Okay, it will have a @request body final policy creation request policy creation request. Okay, now post mapping. Okay, now this is my controller layer. I have a dependency on the insurance part, right? So I'll say private insurance service. Okay, insurance service auto wired. Done. Do a log here. Okay, and now I'll just say insurance service dot create insurance policy. In this, you can see it only takes insurance policy type of object and not policy creation request. So I have to convert the policy creation request to insurance policy. Okay, so if I compare them side by side, where's my model? Insurance policy. If you compare them side by side, you can see they have items covered, some insured, and yeah, I missed out the type here. So I'll just say private type insurance type. Okay, cool. So what will happen is I'll first have to convert. For conversion, we're using private final object mapper okay, this will throw that error. So I'll say I'll add the two properties that we added in it. I'll say object mapper dot configure deserialization feature, fail on unknown properties. I'll turn this to false, okay? Because otherwise it will fall. And yeah, that's it. Did this as post construct. And what I'll do here is I'll basically convert this. I'll say final or just insurance policy. Actually, you know what? Insurance policy. I'll say object mapper dot convert value from what? Policy creation request to what? Insurance policy dot class. Okay, done. This will have insurance policy, which will give another insurance policy back. So I'll say insurance policy created policy. This is it. I'll say log.info created policy. Okay, and then I'll now have to convert this into something that the controller will send the client back, which is policy created response. So I'll use final policy created response equals object mapper convert value. Now, what is the source here? Source is insurance policy. So created insurance policy, that we created policy, and we'll use the return type is policy created response dot class. Okay, done. Here I'll say return response entity of OK. OK would give 200, but we don't want 200. We'll send 201. So we'll say new response entity. Okay, here it takes two things: object body and HTTP status. The second parameter, as you can see here, object body here would be the policy created response. HTTP status would be created. Okay, and it goes out to the client. Okay, so let me go through what we did here. We basically created a service layer. We created a new insurance service, which has basically these methods: create insurance policy, get insurance policy by ID, create insurance, and get insurance by ID. Okay, this is the part where we create it. So it is going to always return an insurance policy. In case it does not return an insurance policy because something happens, it will throw an exception. Okay, right now we don't have anything, so we are not throwing an exception here. Get insurance policy by ID. If you give it an insurance ID, it may or may not return an insurance policy. Okay, if it does not find anything by insurance ID, it will simply return an optional of null. Otherwise, it will return an insurance policy. Create insurance. This has a dependency on your insurance policy. So we have implemented this method where we have put this check that if this insurance policy, if you do find an insurance policy by this ID, give it to me. If you don't find, throw this insurance policy not found exception. And then if the creation date is beyond, if the creation date is in the past, then throw this insurance policy date exception. Otherwise, go ahead and create a new insurance. Okay, we're not creating the insurance at this point. We're just simulating this by writing this. Okay, what we did here was we designed two exceptions here, and this API, because this API is bound to return something, if something goes wrong, you will signal it using throw, exceptions here. In this case, if something goes wrong and you're not able to find it by the ID, you're going to return an optional of null. And then what we did here is in the policy controller, it's a basic thing. I received the policy creation request, which is my DTO, converted that DTO to a service layer, this thing model. Then I passed it to my service, insurance creation service, which created it. Then it basically converted it back to policy created response, which it would understand, and then it returned this entity. Okay, one more method that I will basically implement is the create insurance part. Okay, so I'll say public. Now, what is the request that we'll receive for this? I think we decided this thing here. Okay. Okay, a couple of things that we have to do here is, if there is already a insurance by this, okay, let's say when you're trying to create a policy, you figure out that there is already a policy with certain such things. Okay, in that case, the controller has to throw a 409, right? As of now, the controller doesn't know how to throw a 409 if you are if you're trying to create a policy which is already created. So for that, we'll have to go to our and create insurance policy and add one more exception there. Okay, just in case you're trying to create a you're trying to create a policy which is already existing. Okay, so let's go ahead and create an exception here. In this exception, I'll say duplicate insurance policy exception. Okay, now this is going to be extended by runtime exception. Okay, public duplicate insurance policy exception. Just passing this message here so that it goes out to super message. Okay, done. Now let's say there is a private method. Okay, this private method basically returns a boolean. Does insurance policy already exist? Okay, where you basically pass the insurance policy. Okay, this guy will return a true or false. Okay, now let's say when you're trying to create the insurance policy, you want to check, do I already have this policy or not? Okay, so you call this method, does insurance policy already exist, and then you pass the insurance policy. If this policy already exists, that means you cannot allow the creation of insurance policy, which means you have to stop the execution by throwing this duplicate insurance policy exception. Policy already exists. Okay, done. Now, how would the controller know? This is a signal to the controller that, hey, something went wrong and this is exactly what went wrong. So now in the controller part, in the policy controller here, okay, the controller is going to basically look for this error. Okay, it will say try, it will wrap this inside this try catch. Actually, it will wrap the entire thing inside a try catch. Okay, okay, inside this try catch. Now, two things can happen here. Okay, one is that it already exists, or something else can happen which I'm not aware of. So let's see the case when it already exists. So we have this, we know that this API will throw duplicate insurance policy exception. How do I know this? Because if I go inside of this, you can see that the method doesn't have anything. So you have to actually investigate. You will go in here and you'll check duplicate insurance already exists. This already exists, which means the controller has to capture this thing. So the controller will say, yes, I am capturing this. Okay. Now, when you capture this thing, log error policy, just print this e dot, just pass this e, duplicate policy. Okay, I'm just printing the error here. Now, if this exception happens, you have to throw a 409, right? So what you will do is you will say policy created response. This part will be null because there will be nothing at this point. So you'll create a null here. HTTP status here instead would be conflict. Conflict basically means it's a 409. Okay, you can check the status here, 409. If anything else happens, in case it is something else, then we will actually wrap this with another catch block where we'll say exception. This is the mother of all exceptions. Okay, if anything else happens that you are not aware of, you will say internal error. Okay, E, and then you'll throw, no, you won't throw anything. You'll just say return new response entity. Okay, here you will pass nothing, and HTTP status code you would pass as internal server error. Okay, so in that way, the API basically, if things get created in this part, okay, we're not doing the 400 at this point. If the policy gets created, 201, okay. If everything goes right, the policy gets created, I'm actually sending a 201, which is created. If the policy already exists, okay, that means that my create insurance policy has a method, does insurance policy already exist, which will check and tell if it already exists. If it already exists, I want to throw this duplicate insurance policy exception. This is a signal to my controller saying, hey, something went wrong, and this is exactly what went wrong. So when this when my controller captures this particular exception, it knows that I have a conflict, okay. So it sends a 409. Any other case, if there is any other error which was not supposed to be thrown by this method but still got thrown, then we will send an internal server error or 500 as the HTTP status code. Any questions so far on this? What is 6 here? Vaishnavi Digore. Did you, what is 6 here? Vaishnavi?
Sorry sir, by mistake it's happened.
Oh, acha, okay, ठीक है, cool. This is what this is how you will basically design the controller layer and everything, okay. So if you pay attention to this, we have, I mean, we said that we would cover all of these things, but we couldn't, so we'll do it tomorrow in tomorrow's session. But what we have done so far is we first decided how the product would look like, okay. We decided the policy, we figure out in the product which part will be variable part and which part would be fixed part. My insurance is the fixed part, insurance policy is the variable part. So I created a separate internal structure, insurance policy. Here I designed basically this thing. I created 2 model classes for that. So you have your insurance policy and then you have your insurance, okay. Then I decided the controller layer where I have this policies path. So in my policy controller, I have this policy path here. Okay. Then I decided what the request would look like. Post request on this would look like this: items covered, type of insurance, maximum sum insured, all these things. And then I decided what the response is going to look like. So for this, I created this policy creation request, which has these things. And for the response, I created policy created response, which has all of these information. You can see this has the ID, this has the ID. Okay. Now, once this is done, I said my API would return either of these, I mean, any of these. Okay. So if something is done properly, if policy gets created properly, I am returning a 201, which is a created. If this policy already exists, I'm returning a 401, which is conflict. If this policy already, I mean, if something else happens, I'm returning a 500, which is internal server error. Now, in the service layer part, I have defined this insurance policy. Here, my business logic lies. In this business logic, one of the requirements is that you cannot proceed with policy if it already exists. So I have this method written here, which takes the insurance policy and it returns a Boolean. Okay. If it is true, that means it already exists. So I'm throwing this exception from my API. This is a runtime exception. This API gets caught in this controller. Controller catches it and controller knows that it's a conflict. So it returns this particular response. Okay. For today's session, let's just finish it here. Tomorrow we'll finish the rest of it. Okay.
हेलो सर
Yes.
सर कौन से मतलब कोड शेयर कर दीजिएगा सर मतलब होती है गिटहब पे
अच्छा ठीक है मैं कोड अपलोड कर दूंगा ठीक है
ठीक है
ओके चलो ठीक है बाय गुड नाइट